Lovely to see everyone for today's lunchtime lecture, which is marking the beginning of our new Jewish Renaissance and Lyons Learning Project series, which is on Jewish country houses. We're going to be alternating these lunchtime lectures with a series of trips to Nymans, to Waddesdon, to Ightham Mote, and hopefully in the autumn to Upton House as well. So I'm sure all of these are going to come up in today's talk, but over the next few weeks, we're going to focus on each of these country houses individually, as well as looking at Winchester and looking a little bit more widely at other Jewish places of interest around the southeast, particularly the southeast, a little bit the southwest. So we're also going to do a session, for example, on Chagall windows and have a visit to Tudley. So there's going to be a lot going on in these next few weeks, but today is very much an introductory session, and there is no one better to introduce Jewish links to country houses and the Jewish Country Houses Project than Professor Abigail Green, who I'm really delighted we have with us today. Abigail is Professor of Modern European History at Brasenose College, Oxford. She's published award-winning work. It won the Sammy Raw Prize in particular on Moses Montefiore. And I know she has a huge research interest in 19th century liberalism and the Jews. But the reason we've invited her today is that she is leading the Jewish Country Houses Project that many of you will have seen launched at Limud this year and featured in Jewish media, including Jewish Renaissance. So we're delighted that Abigail is with us here today. I'm going to pass over to her to do an introductory talk, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A a little bit later on. So if you do have questions, please pop them in the chat during the talk, and then we'll bring you on screen later on to be in conversation with Abigail. So thank you again, and Abigail, over to you. Oops. You're on mute there.
Yeah, I'll try again. It's a great pleasure to be invited to speak about the Jewish Country Houses Project as a part of this broader program of trips and talks. In this talk, well, I'm not going to talk about all the houses, but there will be other talks which engage with different aspects. I think Tom and Jacqueline's talk, for example, is likely to talk about Upton more. I'm going to now share my screen. Okay, I'm trying to show from the beginning. There we are. So this talk is going to be a kind of general introductory talk. But I'm actually going to start by drawing your attention to another Jewish heritage initiative, which is connected, which is our mobile exhibition, which some of you may have seen at Limud, and which is now on show outdoors at Gunnersbury Park until June the 25th, and in Crawley Museum till the end of May. Gunnersbury in particular is another former Rothschild property, and it's actually a brilliant local history museum with a Jewish twist. So it might be an opportunity for you to see it, but I think it will also be in Upton in September, so that might be another chance. So this exhibition, Country Houses, Jewish Homes, emerges from the Jewish Country Houses Project, which I've been leading for 7 years now. The project, next slide. But now I'm in full screen mode, you see, I can't actually use, there we are. The project focuses on a hitherto unidentified group of country houses, those built, acquired and renovated by Jews, and takes them as a starting point for exploring the world of a group we think of as the Jewish aristocracy. So methodologically, this is a kind of maybe it's interesting for you too. The project emerges from a process of knowledge exchange with the heritage sector. So I've learned an awful lot from working with curators and local history initiatives. And actually, this has been key, I think, to the success of this project at an intellectual level, because it's forced us to engage with material which hasn't been well structured by academic historians like myself. The project has a British centre of gravity because more houses have survived here, and because the country house is a particularly important facet of our national heritage in Britain. But actually, none of the historians in the project are British historians, and we see the project in explicitly European terms. So we started with National Trust houses, and here we have some of them, but the group is always expanding. So it may be that there are more, which I haven't yet quite got to. Ascot, no, it's there. And we expanded our scope within Britain. So here we have a group of British houses, which I've tried to group in different ways so you can get a sense of the different kinds of themes which emerge when we think about these houses. So there are houses which speak to the history of that kind of intermarried group of elite Jewish families known as the cousinhood, the Rothschilds, Montefiore's, Salomons, Montagues, Beersteds, Lyons. You could tell a story about Jewish women and their engagement with different aspects of British society, and when they marry out and when they don't. If we think, for instance, about Lady Waldegrave at Strawberry Hill, Mary Cohen at Ightham, Sybil Sassoon at Houghton Hall, which is one of the great country houses in Britain, definitely a stately home. German Jewish dynasties like the Messels, the Sterns, the Seligmans, the Mons, and the Hirsches. Or you could tell a story perhaps about Jews and Empire, looking at houses with West Indian connections like Maristow, which is the pink one. Landlords who were people who made money in South Africa, like Tilney, and houses like the Sassoon houses, which actually are a different kind of empire house because the Sassoons were Baghdadi Jews in origin. So there are lots of things you can do with these British houses, but actually what we did was to think about them, but also to spread our wings to Europe. And on this slide, you'll see a collection of European houses. And I've chosen these particular European houses, I mean, there are a lot more of them, because they speak directly in different ways to the histories of houses in the UK. So the Château de Champs in France, for example, is an 18th century national icon, which was revived by its Jewish owners, just like Strawberry Hill House or houses, or Houghton Hall, for example. So Sybil Sassoon very much did that there, or Senef next door. I mean, Senef has different kinds of connections. The family is linked to the Makatas by marriage and philanthropic connections as well. There's a Hungarian house which is modelled on Houghton Hall, which is a Rothschild house in Buckinghamshire. You will be going to Waddesdon, which is within that kind of Rothschild area in Buckinghamshire. Weidhofen actually, and der Ybbs, is the focus of a Lower Austrian cluster of Rothschild houses. So when we think of Rothschildshire in Buckinghamshire, there's a parallel in Austria. And if we look at the lower level, we've got Holocaust rescue houses, which resonates very much with the role of British families like the Rothschilds in the Kindertransport. We've got Schloss Freienwalde, which belongs to the assassinated German politician Walter Rathenau, whose mausoleum was designed by the brother of Ludwig Messels, who owned Nymans. There's Sans Souci, which is an Indian Sassoon house, and Villa Melchit in Palestine, which was built by Alfred Mond, and whose children both, Alfred was in fact, his children were baptized, but they then converted to Judaism. And his daughter used to fly the British and the Zionist flag there. So you can see that the British story is sitting within a kind of network of bigger stories, which are stylistic, familial, philanthropic, and which are about the connections of Jews in Britain with Jews in continental Europe and beyond. Now, I am going to focus on the British dimension of the project today because that's what you're looking at. It's also the focus of our mobile exhibition. But it's important to remember that these houses and their histories only make sense if we understand them as part of a broad, pan-European and in some ways global phenomenon. The next thing I'm going to do is to say something about Jewishness. So over the years, we have encountered quite a lot of resistance to the idea of Jewish country houses. And maybe it's interesting to think about that. I think there's probably discomfort around the word Jewish amongst particularly non-Jews at the moment when thinking about this project. So I normally say two things. First of all, I explain that Jewish is not a pejorative word. We shouldn't feel uncomfortable using it. I think it has had a kind of pejorative sense, for instance, in the context of these houses, perhaps around the idea of Jewish taste, which was seen as a kind of glitzy, bad taste. But obviously, we don't see Jewish like that. And secondly, obviously, Jewishness is rarely an exclusive identity. It's actually quite an elusive category. And many, particularly of the individuals who lived in country houses and had Jewish connections or were Jews, resisted being defined by it. And of course, the ambivalence they felt about it did reflect the harsh social reality that Jews faced in the context of anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th century Britain and Europe. When we talk about Jewish country houses, we certainly don't mean that they were less English because they were Jewish, and we're not trying to essentialize Jews or their houses. Rather, the way we understand these houses is relational. So it's about the relationship of their owners to non-Jewish society, which was distinctive. And it's about their relationship of their owners to Jewish society, which was distinctive as well. And to clarify this point, I am going to juxtapose two British houses, one of which you may visit and one of which is not yet on the agenda. So first of all, this one. Whenever we talk about Jewish country houses, this tends to be the house which springs to mind, because Waddesdon Manor is very much a Rothschild house, and even non-Jews know that the Rothschilds are a Jewish family. Built in a neo-Renaissance French style for Ferdinand de Rothschild MP, who was actually an immigrant with a heavy German accent, but also a close friend of the future Edward VII, who obviously himself had quite a lot of Germanic connections, Waddesdon typifies what Viscount Norwich famously described in the House of Lords in the 1970s as the international Jewish banker's taste of the Rothschilds. And you can see the whole quote here. He said, when he said this, Norwich, who sat on the executive committee of the National Trust for 35 years, was actually trying to persuade the government to save a different Rothschild house for the nation. That's Mentmore, which is the one you see here. And you can see the Save Mentmore for the Nation poster there. But this quote, which talks about, he said, it's not, he says this house, I can't quite see the top. He says it's not characteristic, it's not typical. It represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds. But surely, my lords, it is no worse for that. Great art belongs to the world. So I think nowadays we probably understand this idea of the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds as an anti-Semitic dog whistle. And I will talk about that later. But actually what I'm going to do now is to set Waddesdon against another Jewish country house, Eastcliff Lodge, home of the religiously observant Sir Moses Montefiore, and just a short walk from the synagogue he established on the outskirts of Ramsgate. And in this slide, you can see the original exterior of the house, which changed quite a lot, a slide of the interior to the top right, a picture of the synagogue and mausoleum, and in the middle, you can see how the whole complex he built there, as well as a picture of Sir Moses himself. So Eastcliff Lodge wasn't, as you can see, a bling, high-tech French-style chateau like Waddesdon Manor, and it seems to tell a very different story. It was a typical piece of Regency Gothic architecture, the house itself. So in that sense, it was characteristic. The Lady Judith Montefiore Theological College, which you can see in the big picture, although it's now lost, looked like a lot of other Victorian institutions of higher education, kind of classic red brick university style. And only the mausoleum, which is modelled on Kever Rachel near Bethlehem, feels foreign or unusual in a British context. And the Montefiore's chose this style. Well, Sir Moses chose it because at his wife's request, he had restored Kever Rachel on one of their trips to Palestine. So this house is a house which feels unapologetically Jewish, in contrast to Waddesdon, which Jewish visitors sometimes read as a site of assimilation. But that obviously depends on your point of view, because actually there's nothing very assimilatory about a neo-French chateau in Buckinghamshire. It doesn't feel very British if you stop and think about it. Unlike Waddesdon, however, Eastcliff Lodge never made it into the canon of great English country houses, although it is actually a site unique in Europe and of great significance to the Jewish world. And the house itself, in fact, no longer survives, but the synagogue does. But both these sites speak in different ways to the attachment British Jews felt to this country and to their links with other places. So Waddesdon, in its dramatic embrace of French culture, and Ramsgate through its unembarrassed ties to Palestine. Both houses, moreover, became centres of Jewish philanthropy, Eastcliff Lodge in the age of Moses Montefiore, and Waddesdon under James and Dorothy de Rothschild, who established the Yad HaNadiv Foundation there in the aftermath of the Second World War. So these two are classic examples, but even houses which seem at first completely unconnected to the Jewish world often conform to these patterns. So I'm going to bring a third into the mix, which is Ightham Mote. Some way into the project, one of my colleagues established that the second wife of Sir Thomas Collier Ferguson, who owned Ightham at the turn of the century, was a woman called Mary Cohen, who was in fact closely related to both the Rothschilds and the Montefiores. Since then, it's become clear that Sir Thomas believed he was himself of Jewish descent. He had an obsessive interest in Jewish genealogy and was a leading member of the Jewish Historical Society of England. He was friendly with leading Jewish families and in fact had been long before he married Mary Cohen, and he also had a passion for German culture. His first wife had been the daughter of the Oxford Orientalist Max Müller, and the German room at Ightham was essentially a shrine to Goethe. You can see it here, and the medallion picture is Goethe, although the couple loved the music of Mendelssohn too. And in the 1930s, Ightham and other properties belonging to Sir Thomas's daughters sheltered Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe. So to me, this illustrates beautifully both the idea that the Jewishness of these houses is relational and that it has a structuring quality. Because as soon as you stop to look, it's all there: social networks, continental European culture, and international Jewish solidarity. Again and again, we find these patterns in houses that we visit in Britain and in Europe. But there's something else which will seem obvious. As rich Jews, JCH families, as we tend to call them, occupied a particular place in British and European society which set them apart from non-Jewish country house owners, whether they were members of the traditional landed aristocracy or nouveau riche. Families like the Rothschilds, the Cohens, and the Montefiores acquired titles and moved in aristocratic circles, but they also figured prominently in the imagination of contemporary anti-Semitic authors who imagined them as key agents within a broader Jewish conspiracy. So here we have quite an early image which speaks to that theme. It's a slide set in 1814, I think just before the Battle of Waterloo. All the protagonists figure in our exhibition. And this image, and in fact, all of them, well, not Montefiore so much, but Goldsmith and Rothschild are obviously directly related to houses in the Jewish Renaissance program, because the chapel at Tudley is right next to the Goldsmiths' country house. In this cartoon, the Jews, an anti-national element, are conspiring at a key moment in the struggle against Napoleon to drug the king's messenger so they can make a killing to the public's disadvantage. This is how honest folks make money, to quote the title of this image. It's an early variant of the famous Waterloo libel, which was recently traced back to one of the most famous anti-Semitic pamphlets published in mid-19th century France. That's the idea that the Rothschilds had privileged knowledge about the outcome of Waterloo and made money thereby. So this is the pamphlet. The edifying history of Rothschild the Premier, King of the Jews. And of course, we can draw a line from this kind of rhetoric to the vicious political anti-Semitism, which became increasingly widespread at the turn of the century, the legacy of which is very much still with us today. And here you can see a range of anti-Semitic images which play with the same ideas. And I've shown you these images quite early in the talk because I think they provide essential context when we think about the public-facing dimension of the Jewish Country Houses project, and when we think about the position of Jews in European society during the age of the Jewish country house, circa 1830 to 1945, perhaps. This was an age of rising political anti-Semitism that culminated in genocide, and the JCH story in Britain and on the continent has to be set within that broader narrative and related to it. So I'm going to talk about that now in a bit more detail. So all over Europe, country houses are powerful symbols of national identity, evoking the glamorous world of the landed aristocracy and its feudal origins. In Britain, these houses are deeply identified with the social and political establishment. As I think Emma pointed out to me, they're known as stately homes. So the Downton Abbey, you're probably familiar with this television series. So the popularity of Downton Abbey, which incidentally, and I could say more about this, gets Jews absolutely wrong in every respect, suggests that until the current debate about colonialism, we've tended to think quite uncritically about country houses. Now, this is much less the case in continental Europe, which has, with its history of violent revolution, fascism, and communism. And so I've set against Downton Abbey this film, The White Ribbon, which is a really grim film set in a Prussian village before the First World War, in a country house context, but dealing also with village life. It's a very, very unromantic view of that time. That's how country houses and the landed aristocracy tend to be remembered in Europe. But in both contexts, the Jewish country house specifically did have a fundamentally transgressive quality. So historians of class often forget the extent to which religion was hardwired into the old order in Europe, which we call the Ancien Régime, a world in which the landed aristocracy remained an essential pillar of the social and political order. All religious minorities experienced inequality and in many cases persecution, but the position of Jews as a pan-European non-Christian minority, never a majority, was exceptional. Only in the Netherlands was Jewish settlement and land ownership unconstrained and apparently uncontroversial before the French Revolution in the 1790s. Well into the 19th century, Jews elsewhere were precluded from owning real estate except in very rare and anomalous situations. In Italy, most Jews were still confined to urban ghettos. This was also the case in parts of the south of France and in Central European cities like Frankfurt, Pressburg, which is now Bratislava, and Prague. Elsewhere, from Alsace-Lorraine through Germany and the Habsburg lands to Russia, Jewish residence remained contingent. Sometimes it was permitted, it was always very highly regulated, and often it was prohibited altogether. I think we forget that in Britain too, the right of Jews to own freehold property was uncertain before 1831 and perhaps as late as 1846. So in retrospect, this might seem a minor matter, but to contemporaries, it was no such thing, because in 18th and 19th century Britain, citizenship, political rights and property ownership went hand in hand. So the images on this slide come from the so-called Jew Bill controversy of 1753, which was a controversy ostensibly about the right of foreign Jews to be naturalized as British subjects. But really, if you look at these cartoons, you can see that it was also about the right of Jews to buy estates and thereby exercise political power in Britain. So one of the characters here, the satire on the Jewish Naturalization Acts, is saying we can buy estates now, and the prospect of the New Jerusalem is playing with the same idea as well. And indeed, some of the anti-Semitic tropes we saw earlier are already apparent here. The opposition between a Jewish interest and the Christian nation. In the quote above, you'd see, I can't read it because of Zoom, but it says something like, a Jewish landed interest, is not this the boldest experiment that was ever tried by any nation on earth? Will not dominion follow property? So that kind of opposition between a Jewish interest and the Christian nation, the threat of Jewish domination, and the idea of Jewish money undermining the social order, I think already apparent at this point, and connected to the idea of land ownership. The Jewish population in Britain was tiny at this time. There were 8,000 Jews in Britain in the mid-18th century, but the passage of the Jews Naturalization Act prompted riots on the streets of London, and it had to be repealed. Oh, I wasn't expecting to find this. I'll have to hope that my PowerPoint hasn't gone wildly off. So the Jewish financier Samson Gideon was a key figure in this episode. Gideon had established himself at Belvedere House in Kent, which is what you should be seeing, and his desire to guarantee the title behind this purchase seems to have motivated his support for the act. The failure of the act led Gideon to cut formal ties with the Jewish community. He never again publicly attended synagogue, returned his Jewish broker's license as irrelevant, and had his son baptized when he discovered that he himself was barred as a practicing Jew from acquiring a title. Gideon eventually received a Jewish burial, while his son, now a Viscount, went on to found a Christian landed dynasty. I'm really quite concerned about this. I'm just going to see what happens. Okay, no, it's not going to be too bad. I think we'll just stick with it. A Christian landed dynasty. So the main point is that in the 18th century, British aristocracy may have been accommodating to some gentlemanly capitalists who made their fortunes in trade and finance, but this famously open elite was closed to Jews. And going forward, we can see that the history of Jewish country house ownership was actually central to the history of Jewish emancipation in Britain, not just because property ownership is a basic civil right, but because landowning was intimately linked to the exercise of political power. And in this context, I want to remind you that there was a property qualification which barred most commoners from entering Parliament before 1832. So if you didn't have enough property, you weren't eligible to be an MP. And there was also this slippage between the Commons and the Lords. So you could start your career as a commoner, but a successful politician like Benjamin Disraeli might reasonably expect to end that career in the Lords, which is why he needed a country house. Not until the First World War did an enlightened aristocrat think it was actually necessary to provide the British state with a country house for use by the Prime Minister, because before that point, it was assumed that every Prime Minister owned one as a matter of course. Meanwhile, throughout the 19th century, many MPs continued to rely on the local influence that came with land ownership for election. And Jews understood very well the connection between land ownership and political power. In 1841, for example, Anselm de Rothschild wrote from Frankfurt to his brother-in-law Lionel to say that with the brothers now established as squires in Buckinghamshire, he hoped, quote, in a year or two to be able to congratulate you on a seat in Parliament and to admire your eloquent speeches. Sure enough, Lionel was elected an MP for the City of London in 1847, creating an ongoing crisis of democratic accountability. So for 10 years, he had been elected as an MP, but couldn't take his seat in Parliament because he wouldn't swear the explicitly Christian oath which was required of him. So we might think that so this situation was resolved in 1858, and we might think that that would have rendered Jewish country house ownership less controversial, but this was only partly true. And here you can see the cover illustration really for Splendid Paupers. because voices from both the left and the right continued to attack Jewish country house ownership as a threat to the English social order. So Splendid Paupers is a Christmas novella written in 1894 by that great doyen of Victorian radical journalism, W.T. Stead. And you've had plenty of time to look at this image, so you probably feel, as I do, that it speaks for itself. We've got the British aristocracy selling up their castles and estates to Glogul and Falmon, who are both Jews, of course. And in fact, there were many other texts with similar themes written by classic figures like Rider Haggard and H.G. Wells. So it was a common theme, and not just in Britain, actually, but in Holland and France and so on. Moving on, but dwelling on the same theme, here we have a pamphlet written by the British founder of the Imperial Fascist League and published in the US in the 1930s, which underlines how transgressive the idea of a Jewish aristocracy still was in the interwar period, when it mingled with a more international and explicitly racial anti-Semitism. And you'll see in the cartoon, don't he take after his mother, my lord? You've got the English aristocrat and this rather looking Jewish mother and the baby in between. And this is apparently actually based on a real anecdote told about Lord Rosebery, who married Hannah Rothschild, and their children. Splendid Paupers bears very direct comparison with the work of Edouard Drumont, who we see here, a man they called the Pope of anti-Semitism. Drumont wrote the classic anti-Semitic text, Jewish France, La France Juive, which you can see here. And he was also the editor of La Libre Parole. And there were some images of La Libre Parole, which was an anti-Semitic magazine, which appeared in an earlier slide. It was explicitly anti-Semitic, and there were regular columns called Chateau d'Israël, or kind of Jewish castles, which featured in it, which dwelt with this theme of Jews buying up landed estate. And why did this matter? I think because, except in France, European Jews fought for emancipation not into a society of more or less equal citizens. We still have in this country a House of Lords and a House of Commons, but into a society that was a society of orders. In the German lands of Central Europe, noble estates, like our House of Lords, had a specific status, and both land ownership and noble status could bring specific political rights. So when Jews fought to acquire land and titles, they knew these things were a pathway to joining the political nation, something the Christian nobility were keen to resist. In Austria, for example, the ability of Jews to own land was uncertain in the aftermath of the 1781 Toleranz patent. Joseph II had clarified the law in 1789 by declaring that Jews could bid at public auction for state-owned lands in Lower Austria. And this made it possible for Israel Hoenig, the director of the state tobacco monopoly, to acquire an estate at Velm. And you can see the village of Velm here. With the land came a title, and he had actually asked for a title and was given one after he acquired the property by Joseph. And he also expected, now that he was the owner of a noble estate, that he would be able to join the lower estates of Lower Austria, which was a body a bit like the House of Lords. But they refused to accept him and even tried to prevent his name from being entered onto the land register unless he changed it to a Christian name. And later they persuaded Emperor Francis to revoke Joseph's 1789 decree, which allowed Jews to buy land, and to enforce Jewish property law more strictly. So Königsberg remained the owner of Velm, but his children could only inherit it if they converted it, which of course was exactly the situation which Samson Gideon's children had found themselves in Britain in the mid-18th century. And actually these issues remained a problem well into the 19th century. In Prussia, for example, Fanny Lewald, who's a great German Jewish writer, recounts how the Westphalian Ritterschaft, which is another of these traditional political bodies preserved for the nobility, had tried and failed to prevent Jakob Loeb, a practicing Jew, from being admitted to it after he acquired the noble estate of Schloss Kaldenhof near Hamm. And in Austria, the Moravian estates rejected a 40,000 gulden sweetener and refused to allow Salomon von Rothschild to buy a landed estate in the area. So he couldn't buy land in Moravia, he had to buy it in Prussian Silesia instead. So it's this kind of problem makes it hard to read Jewish country house ownership as an exercise in assimilation, because these were transgressive houses. They reinforced social hierarchies, but they also challenged them, and they often had a self-consciously subversive quality. So one of the central charges made against Jews by anti-Semitic polemicists was that they sought to rule Europe through their dominance of the money markets, replacing the old feudal order with a new financial feudalism. In texts like Rothschild Ier, King of the Jews, which we saw earlier, and Les Juifs, Roi de l'Époque, which you can see here, James de Rothschild, who was Nathan Rothschild's brother, was routinely lambasted as the real ruler of France. And, you know, James was well aware of this. He actually led a legal action against one of these tracts in the 1840s. So he knew perfectly well what he was doing when, only a few years later, he built Ferrières, an extraordinary, deliberately cosmopolitan house which had regal power as its dominant theme. And here James's pretensions to royalty found multiple expression. The most explicit was the lavish use of his initials, his monogram, and the family emblem topped with a crown, clearly proclaiming the reign of the Rothschilds. But he also appropriated French royal emblems like the crescent of Henry II, the son of Louis XIV, and imagery borrowed from the Venetian doges of the Renaissance, who were kind of mercantile princes with whom James identified. Likewise, Walter Rathenau, who I spoke about earlier, Germany's first Jewish foreign minister, found himself in a similar situation. Now, Rathenau had been unable to serve as an officer in the Prussian army because he was Jewish. But as we can see from the anecdote here, he knew exactly what it meant when a Jew bought a Prussian royal palace, as he had done, Freienwalde. He bought it and restored it. And he insisted on retaining the Prussian royal crown, which was on top of the flagpole at Freienwalde. So the court apparently wanted to take it away, but he said no, he bought the whole thing, lock, stock and barrel, and he was keeping the crown too. So perhaps it's not surprising that Freienwalde became a central theme in the anti-Semitic attacks on him before his assassination in 1922. And there was even a libelous rumor that there was a sculpture above the gate of the Berlin Rathenau house featuring the crowned heads of Europe in a sacrificial bowl. So we can see this idea that Jews were replacing the hereditary nobility and royalty of Europe was deeply, very much part of the anti-Semitism scene. So however you read them, I think it should be clear by now that Jewish country houses were in fact as much a hallmark of the age of Jewish emancipation as the cathedral synagogues, which suddenly sprang across Europe in exactly the same time. And so I see them in a way as parallel to that. So cathedral synagogues were also a sign that something had changed. They are, you know, material manifestations of presence built by communities which had traditionally been confined to ghettos and were not allowed to build proud synagogues. So Bevis Marks, for example, is stuck in a private courtyard because the Jews who built it were unsure how it would be received by the surroundings. But the cathedral synagogues of the age of emancipation, here you see Florence, Bucharest, Brussels, Liverpool, and Berlin, spoke to a completely different order. And in my view, Jewish country houses are very much part of that, have to be understood in the same way. We find these houses all over the continent, from Italy through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and the Habsburg lands to Russia and Scandinavia. In a rural society still structured by Christianity, they were, in a way, an existential challenge to the old order. And in this sense, they are also a fundamental feature of both European and Jewish modernity. A symbol and a symptom of change, I think they show more clearly than many things how revolutionary and unsettling Jewish emancipation really was. So far, I've given a kind of overview of the project, and I hope helped you to understand the British aspect in a European context. But in fact, our project engages with a huge variety of issues. So in the mobile exhibition, we touch upon changes in religious observance, hunting, the East End, the City of London, technology, gardens, art collection, Zionism, and the Holocaust. But in the final section of my talk, I thought you might be more interested to think a bit about the public-facing dimensions of the project. And here, maybe the parallel between Jewish country houses and cathedral synagogues is a good place to start. So in the heritage sector nowadays, people talk about difficult or marginalized histories. And from my point of view, there are three different contexts in which this idea applies to the JCH, the Jewish country house. So first of all, there's a Jewish heritage context. Mainstream Jewish heritage tends to be framed in religious and urban terms. So it's about synagogues and cemeteries. And it's also about the urban Jewish heritage of the ghetto, which might mean Venice or Prague or the East End, perhaps. But the Jewish country houses don't fit easily into these categories. The families who lived in them and owned them were not necessarily observant, though some were, and it is something we address in the exhibition. Some of these houses were sites of religious observance. Ramsgate's an obvious example, but rarely has this left such a tangible trace. So we know that the Rothschilds celebrated the High Holy Days in Gunnersbury, but they haven't left, it's not left its mark on the house there. And because they aren't classed as religious heritage, they don't really fit the Jewish heritage mold. Then there's the whole question of anti-Semitism, which I've dealt with extensively in this talk. So when we began the project, some Jewish organizations were worried that focusing on the material heritage left by rich Jews would stimulate anti-Semitism. But heritage theory suggests that engaging with marginalized narratives promotes social inclusion by spreading greater understanding. And that's what we try to do in this project. And I guess we do it through public-facing work by the exhibition, but also by working with curators and people who work in these houses, who often have expertise in art, for example, but not in Jewish history. But we also talk about, I guess, anti-Semitism, which is partly, because it's so central to this history. Most importantly, perhaps, while many of these houses, I've got a bit confused here. So I speak about anti-Semitism, but there's also, for me, a point here about reclaiming the Jewish history of these houses, because while many of them, like lots of other stately homes, have been repurposed, demolished, or exist only as ruins, some, like Waddesdon, are museums which attract hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. So in this context, failing to tell the Jewish story feels like a negation, and obviously it's also profoundly ahistorical. There are many reasons why that story isn't told, of course. Sometimes it's because curators have taken it for granted. At Hughenden, for example, they assumed that Benjamin Disraeli's Jewishness was known to all visitors, but it transpired that in fact it wasn't commonly known, and so it's become part of the story they tell because obviously it's of central importance. Sometimes it's because houses have many layers and curators haven't found the Jewish layer to be particularly interesting until recently. So Strawberry Hill House was a house which was built by Horace Walpole and is feted really as the origin point of English Gothic. And the stories of its Jewish owners have only really become more prominent now, partly through our work with that property. And there are parallels with, for example, the Château de Senef or the Château de Champs in continental Europe. Or you might look at Bletchley Park, which is a house which belonged to the Lyon family. And obviously the story of the code breakers of Bletchley takes center stage, and the Lyons themselves is not the primary narrative. But also there's the question that curators often don't really understand Jewish history and lack the confidence to address these themes. For example, it's a common misunderstanding that because the Jews who owned these houses were not observant Jews or very observant Jews, their Jewishness may have been irrelevant to them. Then there's the British heritage context. So in Britain, people tend well, not everyone, but, you know, it's possible to read our project through the prism of inclusive heritage and the so-called culture wars. But actually, it sits quite awkwardly in this context. For chronological reasons, the history of the Jewish country house postdates the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833. There are plenty of empire houses, but Jewish country house families don't really figure, for example, in the slavery compensation database. Obviously, all great wealth entails the exploitation of people and resources, and Jewish country houses weren't different in this regard. So in our exhibition, we try and address these issues, but in a way that recognizes Jewish involvement in slavery or empire, but also contextualizes it appropriately. But we also make clear that these houses can't be simply read as straightforward sites of privilege and exploitation, because uniquely they also served as a vehicle for the emancipation of a historically persecuted and disadvantaged minority. And because the wealth that was the source of the owner's power and privilege was also a source of terrible vulnerability, as you can see in the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which I've spoken about. And that brings me on to the Holocaust, the third context. Other European countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands are obviously engaging with the problematic history of and heritage of colonialism, but they're also engaging with the problematic heritage of the Holocaust in a way that the National Trust, for example, doesn't need to do. Actually, it could. There are Nazi houses like Mount Stuart, which still exhibits a little porcelain SS man on one of the mantelpieces. But this history isn't so sensitive here because, unlike most of continental Europe, post-war Britain was not awash with perpetrators. Jewish country houses in this country just don't have histories of expropriation, occupation, and Nazi ownership, and their owners were not murdered in the camps, although there is some overlap between the houses of refuge that sheltered child Holocaust survivors on both sides of the Channel. So working with the heritage sector in continental Europe does pose quite different challenges to doing it in the UK. And obviously, we don't want to say, well, we're British, you need to do it our way, because that would be really insensitive and unsuccessful. But I think there's also something more nebulous, which is worth thinking about. So inclusive heritage is a concept in Britain, but in France, they don't have the same words for it. What they have is patrimoine national, national patrimony. But this is a concept which carries entirely different baggage. As one French administrator put it to me at the conference we held on the French Riviera, the Jewish houses administered by the Centre des Monuments Nationaux, which is a kind of equivalent of the National Trust, are conceived of as French patrimoine français. And she wasn't at all sure that the president of the CMN would be happy to think of them instead as Jewish patrimoine juif. And there's something much more exclusive about this idea of patronage, which makes it harder to tell multiple narratives. And then there's the whole problem of state secularism, which is apparent in France and Belgium. So Villa Kerylos on the Riviera belonged to the Reinach family, who figures centrally in the history of French Jews. But the Jewish context is not mentioned in any of the leaflets about this house. And that's because to the administrator who put them together, he said it was out of the question. To out someone as Jewish in France is like taking you back to 1941. So you simply can't do it. You can't. It's much more problematic to say they were Jews in a public-facing way. And if we move further east, we have a totally different set of problems. In Hungary, the only surviving public-facing Jewish country houses are all closely associated with the Orban regime. So in rural Hungary, it may be neither possible or even perhaps desirable to draw attention to their Jewish histories. So these are all still live issues. You'll see when you visit, if you do visit these houses, that some of them are engaging with the Jewish history more actively than others. So there are different points in the process. And I think that's a good moment to stop and take questions if you have any. Can't hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Abigail. Very, very interesting what you ended with. We'd actually had a question come in that was then withdrawn. Marion question in kind of halfway through, kind of saying, but what about kind of how the various houses now describe kind of their Jewish links, and how the wider local communities reflect, sustain this history? And I think she then withdrew it because you kind of addressed that already. But I just wondered if you'd noticed any kind of sorry.
Well, I think the thing is, in this country, the way we tend to think about these houses is in terms of class.
Right.
So, for example, we've done a lot of work with Worth Park. So the house which belonged to Sir Moses Montefiori's brother Abraham's family and their descendants. So the house has been destroyed, but the gardens have been recently restored, and there's a very active local history society. But the interesting thing is that, you know, their default is really to think about upstairs, downstairs, and to think about it in terms of class. And they kind of know that they were Jews, but it's not the center for how they think about it. But if you go to Germany, I mean, somewhere like Freienwalde, Bad Freienwalde, and Rathenau's house, it's only really been preserved because of the Jewishness, and it's the central point in the narrative. Although I'm sure that you can analyze relationship between Rathenau and that house and its surroundings in terms of class as well. So, you know, definitely different places have different narratives which feed into how the story of these houses are told. And then I suppose I have been, I mean, you know, the National Trust has its own set of ways of thinking about houses, and grassroots initiatives. I mean, we have found that often the memory of these families is kind of cultivated at a very local level, because often they were quite generous to the local community, and they tend to remember. The narrative is then somehow slightly different because it's about the relationship between the families and the local community.
Interesting. I was just wondering, because you've been articulating differences about class, kind of in terms of particularly Britain as a whole or England as a whole. What about within the Jewish world? I mean, one of the things I was struck by is kind of the difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi families, and kind of this historic there is a perception, which I don't know is completely true, but the kind of the wealthy Sephardi families and then the lower class incoming Ashkenazi Jews, although of course what you're drawing out is there's some very wealthy Ashkenazi families too. But I'm just wondering if you've noticed anything in the differences between country houses depending on that, or what do you think of the class structure within the Jewish community?
Well, one of the points we make, and this is really the insight of my colleague Jacqueline Granick, is that so we do argue that this group should be understood as a Jewish aristocracy because they are functioning as aristocrats in a European and British context. But within the Jewish world, they also actually function as an elite, a kind of an upper class. There are a lot of jokes about Rothschilds and Montefioris, and actually these jokes are all about class. So I think Jacqueline will probably talk about that in her talk, so I don't want to preempt it too much. Okay. But there's an acute awareness that these Jews are the Jews who are Jews, and you know there's a kind of relationship of mutual of deference and obligation with the Jewish world, right, which makes them, you know, I guess one half of the traditional elite of money and learning, which used to dominate Jewish communities. Right. So in a way, it's traditional, but there's also a sense that, you know, there are lots of these jokes about them getting won over the kind of the prince or the kind of aristocrat who's a bit too big for his boots, and it's about the fact that they're operating in that world as well. So I think the Jewish world is very important for thinking about the class status of these people. The Sephardi Ashkenazi thing is quite different. I mean, I think the idea that it was somehow particularly British, perhaps, the idea that the Sephardim are kind of wealthier. but more established. Maybe they were more established, but Ashkenazi families had obviously been well established, from the late 18th, early 19th century. Families like the Rothschilds and the Cohens went back to the late 18th century in Britain, early 19th century. More interesting in a way is the way in which what Sephardic families are often doing is marrying into the Jewish aristocracy in Britain, acquiring a kind of British title, but retain, this is what the Sassoons do, but then kind of retaining. So they're able to bring that aristocratic status, but they keep their foot in their Jewish communities in Asia. But it just gives them a different kind of standing there. So there's somehow a flexibility there, which is quite interesting. And there's someone called Sasha Goldstein-Sabo who is working more on that. It's definitely a recognizable phenomenon. I mean, the Seabank Montefiores in a way are a good example because they're actually a Moroccan Jewish family, but they managed to kind of pretend that they were really the very anglicized Montefiores, although they were slightly different.
I was wondering if there's any kind of reflection of that Sephardi heritage, perhaps in the collections within the houses or in the way that the houses, the rooms look physically. Is there any kind of trace of a kind of more Oriental kind of architecture or collecting?
I'm not the visual strand of the project. Tom will talk more about that, perhaps. Okay. But Orientalism, I guess, was something people played with anyway. I'm just thinking that the Stearns in Strawberry Hill had a I think a Turkish room, but of course they were actually not Sephardim.
Of course.
So I think it's kind of complicated how you choose to read it.
Interesting. So we've got a question from Alison. We've just got 5 minutes left, so I want to take from the audience. And Alison's asked, she said, I was interested in your remark that Downton Abbey gets Jews wrong. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, so on several different levels. So the house in which Downton Abbey is filmed was actually the home of Almina, who was the illegitimate daughter of one of the Rothschilds. So it had a direct Jewish connection. That's the first point, which is interesting to make. At a moment when all this stuff, splendid paupers and everything, was very current, and people were very aware of the presence of Jews in Edwardian high society. Lady Cora is actually born Cora Levinson. I mean, she's not Jewish, but her father was. Obviously, she's American. People don't mention it. I mean, it would have been something which people have meant. It would have been something of which everybody was acutely aware. And the idea that it only emerges in something like series 5 when a Jewish, kind of a wealthy Jewish businessman and his son emerges and marry into the family is extraordinary. I mean, it's just totally off. And there's something dishonest about the failure to grapple that. And the fact that, oh, well, she wasn't Jewish herself is neither here nor there, because all these people who were like Lady Waldegrave, for example, Frances Braham of Strawberry Hill, everyone called her the Jewish Lady Waldegrave, although she had been baptized at birth because her father was known to be Jewish. So it's just not a pass. So there's a kind of dishonesty there. But then when you get to the family, I forget what they're called, whose son marry into the Downton Abbey clan. I mean, these people, well, for a start, they're Russians, but the Russians arrived later, and the Edwardian rich Jews, I mean, they would have been German. They would never have been Russian. They couldn't possibly have fled, and you can see he's looking for a pogrom for them to have fled. So he has them fleeing Odessa in 1872 because he realizes they must have needed some time to make money. So there's that. Then the mother is descended from one of these Sephardi families. She claims her family have been in Britain since the 14th century. Anyway, a moment when there were no Jews in Britain at all. And to cap it all, they have a country house in Yorkshire. I mean, Jewish country house families never bought in Yorkshire because it was much too far from London. It's just inconceivable that they would have had a house in Yorkshire. It's so off. So there's a kind of a willingness to engage with it, but at the same time, it's just wrong on every count because there's actually there's no meaningful memory about these issues. I mean, I thought it was fascinating.
Oh, fantastic. Well, this was Alison's question, so I brought her on screen. Is there anything you wanted to add or ask, Alison?
I don't, I was very interested in your answer because you covered several aspects of the show that I'd forgotten about, like Lady Cora's father, of course. But I just think this shows that your project is very necessary, because people must have a lot of misconceptions about Jewish families and Jewish country houses. So I think your research will really open people's eyes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then just to finish off, we have a question from Rosalind. She's not on screen, so I can't spotlight her, but Rosalind, I'll ask it, but please, if you want to come on screen, just pop your video on. But she said it's a wonderful talk and thank you very much. But what she's asked is there a website or a book which lists the country houses of Europe, including the UK, which have Jewish roots or history? Like, how can the wider...
So first of all, I would draw your attention to our website, which does have a lot of information on it. So this is www.jch.history.ox.uk, I think.
Brilliant. So
you Google Jewish country houses, you will get to it. And particularly, I'm thinking there's a resource pack there are two resource packs. There's one which focuses on the Holocaust and one which is for UK heritage professionals, which is the nearest thing to what you're asking for. And secondly, I want to say that we are publishing a book which will appear in October 24, published by Profile and the National Trust, with fantastic photographs by the world's leading architectural photographer, Hélène Binet, lots of, I hope, approachable and engaging essays. About a third of them are British, the other 2/3 will be dealing with with European houses. There are more, but we haven't covered all of them. All of them are open to the public, which is an important point. So look out for Jewish country houses.
And maybe Jewish Renaissance will cover it, or even possibly host a launch if you would be interested in that.
I'm sure we would be.
So thank you so much. And as Abigail kept mentioning, she's part of a team working on this, and Tom and Jacqueline, who are two of the other academics she referred to, are going to be speaking later on in the series, in fact in 2 weeks' time, and they are going to be looking at the project but more from that European perspective. And I believe they're particularly going to be looking at the concepts of philanthropy within Jewish country houses, although
I think it's quite British, their paper, actually, but I could be wrong.
Oh, interesting. So I know they said to us that they were going to talk about quite a lot of the Nazi influence and Jewish philanthropy. So we'll be open and we'll see. Next week, we won't have a lunchtime lecture because we're taking anyone who wants to come on a trip. So next week we're looking at Nymans, which belonged to the Messel family.
I did mention it briefly because Ludwig Messel was exactly the kind of man who might have figured in Downton Abbey. He was a German Jewish stockbroker, and his brother was one of the most important architects of Wilhelmine Berlin, and he designed the tomb, the Rathenau family tomb, and also an iteration of Nymans.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you. Well, we've arranged a special tour of the house and gardens for people coming along, but also John Hillary, who I think possibly is descended from the Messel family. He's certainly written about them. He's going to meet us and he's going to give you a talk all about them and the kind of Jewish connections to the house. So if you haven't yet booked but want to, please do come along to that.
John is a very good speaker.
Yeah, fantastic. And just a big thank you again to Alison, because you've really set the scene. Abigail, sorry, you've really set the scene for what we're doing beautifully. And I know a lot of people are very interested in kind of what you're talking about in your projects, and we hope we'll keep covering the projects as it goes on and the book gets published. So
great. Well, thank you I'm excited that you've set up these tours. There are many more, more places you could visit. That's all I would say.
Well, if they go well, we'll carry on next year. So wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone, and hope to see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Bye.
Bye.